Another day, another sham indictment, my friends. You see, in America right now, justice is not a higher principle that is pursued for the sake of preserving society and making sure proper conduct occurs between its members. Justice is instead a smokescreen used to persecute people under the guise of benevolence, and that is precisely what is happening to the former President Donald Trump in his latest indictment, which is spearheaded by Fannis Willis, the district attorney of Fulton County, Georgia. We'll talk all about this much more in a second, who is basically alleging, among many other things, that Donald Trump, his advocates, and his attorneys in criminal conspiracy all knew that Donald Trump lost the 2020 election, in her words, and the implication of the indictment, and despite knowing this, acted in conspiracy to illegally overturn the election. This is essentially the argument. This is essentially what the implication is of the case. And this, of course, does not hold up under scrutiny. Now, before I get into this, I must say this. I won't dwell too much on the actual indictment and the actual charges because fundamentally, there are thousands of other people you can listen to that actually address the charges and actually go through them one by one and read the whole indictment. That's not my expertise. That's not why I'm here. I know enough to make convincing arguments, but I don't know enough to give you a full-throated legal analysis of every little letter and section of the indictment. But what I will address, I will use these charges as an off-ramp to discuss the cultural and philosophical implications of prosecutors using this kind of method to persecute their political enemies and what the impacts of that could be generally. But as I mentioned, the Trump indictment coming out of Georgia rests on four premises. Number one, that Trump lost the 2020 election. Number two, that Trump knows he lost the election. Number three, that Trump knows he lost the election, but acted to overturn the election anyway. And number four, that Trump and his allies know he lost the election, but acted to overturn it anyway. Now, all of these presumptions fall if we can prove that Trump did not think he lost the election, and in fact, Trump was convinced that he did win the election, which, if you understand Donald Trump as a political figure in our mainstream culture, he's one of the most arrogant and self-assured men, and I don't mean that negatively, this is an observation, one of the most arrogant and self-assured men in modern politics. He believes, no matter what, that he is a winner, and if he doesn't, and if there is something that says that he's not a winner, he will use his mentality to overcome that thing, even if it's through sheer brute force. This is how he was able to be a successful real estate tycoon. This is how he was able to build so many businesses and to rack up a over $6 billion net worth. This is how he was able to run for president despite all of the attacks thrown against him, is because he had this sort of confidence that despite what anyone else said, despite whatever was thought, that all that matters was what he thought about himself and his situation, that he was the best. That alone should disqualify the indictment and the presumptions that it makes. But let's even go further, because this is just so absurd the deeper you go down this rabbit hole if you actually understand the particular claims of the indictment. Now, of course, as I mentioned, the claim is that Trump and his allies collaborated to engage in a criminal conspiracy to overturn the election. And to prove this, the indictment literally cites instances of Donald Trump and his allies engaging in political advocacy and legal advocacy, i.e., two perfectly legal things, in pursuit of their vision of the election. For example, Act 26 of the indictment says, on or about the third day of December, Donald John Trump caused to be tweeted from the Twitter account. Wow. Blockbuster testimony taking place right now in Georgia. Ballot stuffing by Dems when Republicans were forced to leave the large counting room. Plenty more coming, but this alone leads to an early win of the state. And the indictment goes on to say, this was an overt act in the furtherance of the conspiracy. Act 24 says Rudy Giuliani basically made arguments before a Senate committee in the Georgia Senate, and apparently him making these arguments is also an act in furtherance of the of the conspiracy. Act 22, which is the most ridiculous act that so many people have pointed out, says Donald John Trump caused to be tweeted from the Twitter account. Real Donald Trump. Georgia hearings now on OAN. Amazing. This was an overt act in furtherance of the conspiracy. So essentially, advocating for political positions and advancing legal theories in front of courts and in front of public legislative bodies is apparently an attempt to advance a criminal conspiracy. One of the tenets of a conspiracy is that it has to be at least somewhat secretive, and it also has to be collaborative and interconnected between everyone in the enterprise furthering the conspiracy. Now, this indictment charges over 18 plus people, not just Trump, but 18 plus people, including his advisors, social media influencers, people who were just adjacent to Trump world, and yes, his lawyers. So Fannis Willis wants people to really believe that everyone in this indictment willingly and knowingly and falsely believed that the election was not won by Donald Trump. They knew that it was actually not won by Donald Trump. And then, despite knowing this, they actually went against what they knew and tried to go ahead and illegally overturn the election through illicit means. When in all reality, this happened all in public. This happened through the proper channels, through media, through legislative committees, through courts and everything of that sort. And the indictment also attacks the fact that Giuliani and others in different states other than Georgia went and advocated for Trump's vision of what happened in 2020 before different states and before different people. In fact, apparently calling Mike Pence and presenting this theory to him, this alternative legal theory about what happened, is an example of furthering a criminal conspiracy. Again, as I mentioned, we're not going to spend a lot of time. I'm not going to go deep and penetrate this, but I'm just going to say this. The reasoning is specious. The logic is laughable. And the idea, what's really happening here, if you peer beneath the surface, because we have to understand something, my friends. What matters is not the argument itself. What matters is what the argument presumes. Because if you can address what the argument presumes, you can actually defeat the argument before you even look at the argument. Because if a house is built on a corrupt foundation, the house will never stand no matter what you do to it. The indictment presumes that certain kinds of freedom of expression that go against the orthodoxy, that go against the established order, that go against the official narrative, the current thing, so to speak, are inherently and woefully wrong, but not only wrong, they are illegal. This indictment is a radical attempt, a radical perversion of legal theory and jurisprudence in an attempt to criminalize freedom of expression and criminalize dissent. That is the Fannis Willis indictment in a nutshell. If you want more information, go to Robert Barnes, Bill Fry, Robert Govia, my friend. Go, any of them will give you more than that. But as far as I'm concerned, that's the indictment. Now, I mentioned there are cultural and philosophical implications to this indictment. So we have to ask ourselves, what are they? Well, we have to ask ourselves, as I mentioned, foundations are important. The foundations of a particular thing will let you know if that thing is stable, if it is sound, and it will also let you understand it more than you would have in any other circumstance. We have to ask ourselves, what are the foundations of this indictment? In other words, what is the reason that an indictment like this could be brought in our current legal system in defiance of justice? And more importantly, what is the idea that is animating this indictment? And to that, my friends, we have to consider a few things of great import. It is not an insignificant fact that Fannis Willis, the prosecutor spearheading this, and the demographics that she represents in Fulton County are all heavily progressive. We should understand the case is poisoned from the gate because there is no sense of impartiality that can be reasonably expected in a jurisdiction like Fulton County, Georgia, where a majority of the elections go to Democrats, where a majority of the public officials are Democrats, where several leftist social groups like the Martin Luther King family, a majority of them, their foundations, the SPLC, Antifa, and other groups have immense influence over the social fabric of Atlanta. We cannot expect a jury pool from Atlanta not to be tainted. But they're tainted primarily because they have a progressive worldview. And if you have a progressive worldview, which is antithetical to President Trump and his worldview, you cannot be an impartial observer of him because President Trump right now is the current enemy of progressive mind, so that Fannis Willis as a progressive will actually factor into us understanding the idea behind this indictment. Very simply, my friends, as I mentioned, every single thing that happens begins with a principle or a concept or philosophy. And Fannis Willis, being a progressive, my theory is that she doesn't actually believe in the Constitution. She doesn't actually believe in first principles. She doesn't actually believe in sound philosophy or natural law, which are the foundations of the American legal system, because if you don't have philosophy, then law is meaningless. All law is downstream from philosophy. Law is downstream from questions of what is justice and how should justice be properly administered. Those are two philosophical questions that literally produce the need and the faculty of law. If you don't actually consider those questions, then how in the world can you have any legal system? You can't. But Fannis Willis doesn't really care about those questions. She instead cares about furthering her social vision of the world. And I know this because before she was even elected, before she was even in the capacity to examine the totality of evidence against President Trump, or the supposed evidence against President Trump, Fannis Willis made it her mission, just like other legal officials have, like Letitia James in New York. Fannis Willis made it her mission to oppress and prosecute Donald Trump. She said it herself. She ran on that. So I know that she's operating from a progressive ethic, because the focus is not on the principle. The focus is on the person as he relates to some sort of abstract group that she opposes. This is the progressive mind. So we have to take a little bit step back through history to understand the significance of all of this. During the early 20th century, the 1900s, there was this period of history, one of the worst periods in American history, called the Progressive Era, where a different ideology, a different way of thinking about what it meant to be an American and what it meant to have a good legal system arose in America and took our country by storm. It infiltrated the courts, infiltrated law schools, infiltrated government. We had several presidents that were produced by the Progressive Era, like Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, amongst many others. FDR on the sort of very tail end, if not after the Progressive Era, who was one of its fruits. And we had several social reformations and social agendas that gained a lot of steam during the Progressive Era. The Progressive Era is especially known for being the era where the administrative state, which is called now the deep state by modern minds, was produced because the progressives did not believe in the sort of individualistic ethic that America was built upon. They did not believe in this idea that man should be left to be a voluntary creature in his society and he should organize relationships for himself. They believed in advancing what they called the sort of the care of the worker, the sort of care of the oppressed and the downtrodden. So they had a fundamentally class-centric view of the world, as opposed to a sort of individualistic quite view of society and then a principled view of the individual. They had a class-centric view of the world that they then used the government and they used the tool of law to enforce. And to be specific with you, progressives during this era advanced a different legal theory than what had been accepted for about 100 or so plus years prior, when going all the way back to the founding generation. And this legal theory is actually, I think, the basis for the Fannis Willis prosecution against Donald Trump, and also the other numerous instances of progressive lawfare that we've actually seen enacted in our country quite recently. Let's actually read this philosophy in its inherent. So I want to bring your attention to a man called Roscoe Pound. Roscoe Pound was a legal scholar, a professor, and one of the architects of progressive legal theory during the Progressive Era. And Roscoe Pound criticized the courts at that time for being too adherent to moral foundations and first principles. In fact, he called it mechanical jurisprudence. And to Roscoe Pound, mechanical jurisprudence was this act of deciding the law according to a set of rules that go beyond the particular interests of the society and instead accord to universal ideas. So having sort of moral rules decide what your rulings will be was a problem for Roscoe Pound. He found that to be bad. And he called for the adoption of what is called sociological jurisprudence. He basically imported this idea from Europe, and he essentially ignored the entire history of American law. And he also drew his ideas about civil code and how courts should be constituted by embracing this European idea of mechanistic of sociological jurisprudence, and he basically said that this idea of sociological jurisprudence is viewing the law as the conception of law as a means to further social interest. Like, that's actually a paraphrasing of a quote of what he said. So Pound believed that the only proper function of law was to further social interest. Now, Professor Edwin R. Keaty, who taught at the University of Pennsylvania Law School, he actually supported this idea of sociological jurisprudence. And he is quoted as saying that legal thought moving away from the sort of mechanistic jurisprudence, the sort of first principles approach, was actually a good thing, and that it goes away from what he called artificiality towards simplicity, and from the individualistic idea to the sort of collectivist idea. And Keaty explicitly said that under sociological jurisprudence, courts should, and I quote, take into consideration the social and economic conditions underlying the cases that come before them and should not base their decisions entirely upon abstract rules. During the Progressive Era, this virus infected the American legal system that said, justice as it is properly understood is not important. What is important is the advancement of certain social classes. Now, in the early 1900s, there was no intersectional leftism that endowed value in collective social classes based on their identity, on their sexuality, on their gender, on their whatever. That didn't exist. That was actually a deviation of progressivism that came later. But when you get closer towards the 1990s and you get closer to our current era, leftism is not only now about being aware and, in some cases, tethering your entire policy prescriptions towards the well-being of social classes. It is now about also tethering it to the well-being of other classes who are oppressed. So it went from just social classes to oppressed classes. We have to understand, if you have a legal theory that says law can be used to advance your temporary goals that accord to a particular political constituency, then we also have a legal theory that justifies the prosecution of particular political figures if they go against the interest of those goals. Fannis Willis is ultimately the product of a long line of legal thinking which placed contemporary issues over fundamental truth, which confused the universal ideas of justice and right and natural law with the local ideas of income inequality and lack of health care and poverty. And this confusion, or rather the rejection of the universal in favor of the local, corrupted our system so much so that it has brought us to a point where someone like Fannis Willis is able to do what she does and get plaudits from the major heavy hitters that are within the legal profession. We have a problem of sociological jurisprudence, which is really just a problem of political favoritism that displaces justice. Justice is a universal idea, my friends, that very simply preserves society, makes sure that you are a man of your word, you ensure that your contracts are enforced, and that it acts as a barrier between you and the right to someone else. That is justice. Justice is not the plight of particular groups in society. And yet, the progressive mind says it is, and the progressive mind will basically use the socialist philosophy to do whatever it wants in furtherance of its ultimate goals. Essentially, the ends justify the means because the ends emerge from a corrupt source. That is what we are seeing. That is the monster we are seeing right now. It is my goal, my friends, not to repeat the talking points of every talker on the internet, but to give you fruit that will nourish you intellectually and spiritually and embolden you to fight back against these foul forces which seek to tear our republic asunder. These foul legal ideas born from the progressive era that are essentially socialist are the reason we are seeing this amount of lawfare happen, not only against President Trump, but against several other people that speak out against the orthodoxy and speak out in favor of eternal truths. We must be aware of where our enemy comes from, so we can not only beat him on the battlefield, but we can walk into his camp and beat him on his home turf. We have to deal with these philosophies that are in our system, by rejecting them, asserting the truths of our system, the American system, what we're based upon, and demanding our politicians and our judges do the same. We need a revolution of the mind. Let this Trump indictment be a warning to all of you. The longer us as Americans languish in ignorance and refuse to study philosophy, refuse to understand the roots of these evils that threaten us, the longer it will be, or rather the shorter it will be, for tyrants to overtake us and oppress us. We can do better. I believe we can do better. We must read, we must study philosophy, we must understand what's going on, and we must be willing to confront these ideas head on and not cower. My friends, if you want to support my mission, donate to my PayPal, my Patreon, my locals, christianwatch.locals.com. Please be sure to comment on this video, like this video, share this video, subscribe to my channel. Be sure to join my Discord, which is in the comment down below as well. I love you guys so much, and please, 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 please remain vigilant, study philosophy, study history, and also please stay pensive. Bye, everyone.